I'm going to talk you through how I process my kick and bass when I'm making psytrance. So here I've got a loop at 142 in G sharp. I'm going to focus on the processing, by the way, not the synthesis or the kind of creation of the actual sounds. So what I've got here, first of all, is a kick drum. This has just come from a sample. Sometimes I use the kick plugin. It just depends. For simplicity, I'm using a sample here. Crucial thing here is that the kick drum is trimmed to exactly 2 beats long, and it's got a little fade out on it. You can see here, a little fade out. So that's the kick. And then the bass. So the way I always do the bass, I use samples a lot. So I tend to synthesize and process the sound I want and then export them as samples, and then just use the Logic inbuilt sampler to play them back. I feel it gives me more control and precision. So this is just one of those kind of bass samples that I've created. You'll see the bass is always on 2 channels, and then those 2 channels are going through a folder track where I can add more processing. So what I do there, crucially, let me just zoom in. If I zoom in on this first bar here. So we've got a kick, which, as I said, is exactly 2 beats long. Then on this channel here, I have the bass note that overlaps with the tail of the kick drum. And then on a separate channel, I have the 2 bass notes that, as you can see, are not playing at the same time as the kick drum. They're completely separate. So the reason I like doing that is that very quickly I can control the feel of the bass line. So especially with this bass one, the bass note that overlaps with the kick drum, the volume's right down. I have a very offbeat sound. If I have it very loud, I get quite a different feel on the kick drum. And basically, just with using that control, you can very quickly, by changing the volume on that one bass note channel, you can very quickly get a feel for how you want the bass line to sound. I tend to go with about -6, so about 6 decibels lower than the main bass line. But it depends. Sometimes in proggy tracks it might be a bit lower, and in faster, more kind of full-on or driving tracks it might be a bit louder. It depends the feel I want to go for. Let's go with -6 here. In terms of processing, so again, looking at this bass note that overlaps with the kick drum, I'm just going to highlight that quarter of the bar, or that 1 beat, so a quarter of the bar, where the tail of the kick drum overlaps with the bass. So if I just solo the kick and put an EQ on there, so you can see what frequencies are being played. It's around here, 56, 55 hertz. So what I do is I just go onto that bass note that overlaps the kick. I just tend to use Logic's channel EQ for this, and I'll just put a dip with relatively small or relatively sharp Q at that exact frequency. So we said it was 55 hertz. And I'd probably put a low cut as well, just a little bit below that. Quite a steep curve, something like that. Maybe a little bit higher. And that means that this bass note that overlaps the kick is literally not playing the same frequencies. And that means I don't worry too much about phasing and so on, that I know other producers spend a lot of time controlling. Because literally that bass note has got the frequencies removed that the kick drum is playing. I could even cut it more like. It's subtle, but it means the two sit together really nicely. Looking at the main bass note, for this I actually use Pro Q2 plugin. for my EQ. This is pretty much the only time I don't use the Logic inbuilt EQ, because I find the Logic built-in EQ is brilliant. And what I do here is I've got a load of presets. I said I was playing in G sharp. I've got a load of presets, one per note. So I go to G sharp, and that gives me essentially an EQ point on each of the fundamental frequencies for G sharp. So essentially each one of these frequencies represents a different octave. And actually, you can do this really quickly in Pro Q2 just by pressing the note on the keyboard down here. So you can see I've got all the notes selected there. And what I will do is always choose the fundamental frequency that's around the 100 Hertz. In G sharp, that's 103.8 apparently. And I'll just give that a little boost, a couple of decibels. And that is just to ensure that the actual offbeat bass line that doesn't overlap with the kick drum has that kind of nice deep presence. I generally don't affect the lower frequencies, because they're starting to really mess with the deep sub bass, and you can get really kind of flabby results on a sound system. I find basically the frequency closest to 100 Hertz works the nicest. I then go to the bus group channel, so a folder in this case, and you can see I've got a few effects lined up. This is a wave plugin called Magma BB Tubes, which is just subtle kind of tube or analog distortion. I sometimes use a bit of that. It depends. Sometimes it improves things, sometimes I find it rounds things off too much. So that's just a matter of taste. Sometimes I use that, sometimes I don't. Then I've got another Pro Q2, and again, I use the same starting point, so G sharp, and again, I've got all my fundamental frequencies lined up. And what I tend to do there is choose a frequency which is the low mids, and I tend to cut that to remove the kind of muddy frequencies. So in this case, I think I'm going to go with 400, and I'm going to do -3 decibels maybe. And I might just make that cue a little bit tighter, a little bit sharper, to make sure it doesn't start affecting these low frequencies down here. Remember, here I'm affecting both bass notes, and I sometimes like to boost some of these higher frequencies as well to bring out the clarity. So without, with, to me it removes the mud, and this frequency up here just brings out the kind of attack and the clarity of the bass line. I sometimes use Logic Exciter, and that I tend to use the frequency that's between the one I've cut for the mud to remove the mud and the one that I've added here to add that kind of crispness and sharpness, which in this case is at 830. It doesn't do every frequency on here, but 820 is the closest. I really like that because the Exciter gives it kind of boosts the harmonics on one of the fundamental frequencies, and you can see it just gives this that crispness and sharpness that helps it stick through in the mix as well. Finally, still on the bus folder or group channel, I've got an LFO tool, essentially making sure that where the first beat of the bar, where the front of the kick drum is, where there is no bass note, it's making sure that's completely silent. And that's just, sometimes you get a tiny little bit of release sound sticking out from the end of the bass note here. You shouldn't, because the release is down, and especially this coming from a sample, but it's just to absolutely make sure. That's it really, it's quite simple. I tend to not, I never compress the bass or compress the kick and bass. So the bass and the kick then go through this kick bass channel. The only thing I have on here is a linear EQ, which I use for filtering. I generally don't have any additional processing on the kick and bass. Yeah, that's just me. And the crucial thing for me then is, let me just go back to a 4-bar loop. The crucial thing for me then is to have a good reference track, which crucially needs to be same BPM, same key. So here I've got this track by Symbolic and YO, which it's bound to sound brilliant. For me, it sounds like I need to get rid of more mud. And for me here, crucially, I'm not trying to sound the same. I'm just trying to sound, if I can, as good, if that makes sense. I'm not necessarily trying to emulate their exact sound. I might bring out 1 decibel up here. I'll just try cutting this as well. It's just really trying to bring out those high frequencies and cut the muddy mids or low mids. And then I haven't processed the kick drum yet, so the kick drum there is just completely bare. I tend to use a bit of channel EQ there. One thing I like to do is quite a wide Q is just cut some mids around 750. You'll hear what that does. For me, it just removes some of that kind of almost wooden knocky kind of sound that you get on psytrance kick drums. Maybe something like that. I sometimes boost something around 3,000 or 4,000 hertz just to bring out the attack. To me, it really helps the kicks sit and stick through in the mix. And I sometimes give it a little boost around 100 hertz or so, just to really give it a bit of extra thud. Gonna remove more mids. What's really nice about doing this is that by removing these kind of knocky wooden mids in the kick and then removing some slightly lower, muddier frequencies in the bass, you're creating a lot of room in those mid frequencies and lower mid frequencies for the synths and other elements to sit and really kind of stick out in the mix. See how that sounds. And one thing I really like to do when I'm comparing my kick bass with a reference track is to listen to it with all the high end taken out. So I have to put the volume up a bit for that. So my track. Again, the idea is not to sound the same, it's to sound as good if possible. It sounds to me like on the reference track, the bass note that sits over the kick drum is lower. And this is why I love having it on a separate channel, because I can literally, I'm just going to turn it down by 1 decibel. What I might do is cut a bit more low end out of that. I think on the reference track the main bass is slightly less subby. And so on. But there's nothing fancy going on really, it's just a few basic effects and a good reference track. And then with some percussion, there we go. Probably need a little bit more tweaking, but the basic idea is there.